Getting to know you, getting to know all about you, getting to like you, hoping that you'll like me. Getting to know you, putting it my way, but nicely. You are precisely my...
Welcome to the Power Factor Show.
Episode 135.
Sponsored by Rainier Ballistics, Hodgdon Powders, and JPL Precision.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Power Factor. This week we're talking again about the Dillon SL900 shot shell reloading press. So as you guys probably recall, back in December I did my first episode on using the SL900, and to be honest, at that time I had the press probably for about maybe 10 days at best, so I didn't have a whole lot of reloading time on that press. And since then I've now been using it for about 6 months, and I have a little bit better feeling for the ins and outs of the press, and that's primarily the focus of this episode. Is we're going to talk about literally all the things that I've learned, some design changes that I've made to the press, things that make it more reliable, some tricks that I've learned, some things that will actually improve the operation of it. This basically kind of a recap summary of the press, but with a lot of information that you may find beneficial. But before we get to that, we always do or typically I should say always do a trivia giveaway in the program. So the giveaway this week is the book Mastering Skeet, which is literally everything that you need to know about skeet shooting and probably some things that you don't want to know about it but are in here anyway. And what I mean by that is that literally the guy who wrote this book, apparently it came from a college thesis paper, and the part of the book that really gets into high detail for anybody who is into engineering, it starts talking about the angular velocity of the clay pigeon and the optimal lead of the clay pigeon from every point that it leaves leaves the house till it travels all the way across the field. So just to give you an idea here, and I'm just going to show you like one part of the book here where it gets into this, but let's see. Okay, well, individual stations here, it goes through, and you can see here literally it's showing what the angular velocity is of the bird and the correct lead for the bird, and this happens to be station 6, and it goes through every single station and does that. But that's just the gory details of the book. There's actually a lot of good discussions here about hold points, look points, setup points, everything you need to know about skeet shooting. So the trivia question to win this book, and we'll do the normal deal, all the correct answers are tossed into a bucket, so to speak, or a hat, and whoever has the correct answer will get tossed in there, and then we'll randomly pull a name. And the question is, and you guys know how much I am a fan of Beretta products, what is the meaning of the Beretta Trident logo? So go figure that out, tell us what the meaning or the history of that logo is, and submit that. And as usual, I would probably recommend submitting it to the email, which is powerfactorshow@gmail.com. The reason being is that we've had cases before where somebody will respond with the answer on YouTube, or they'll respond with the answer on Facebook, and it's kind of like, they tell the whole entire world what the answer is, so everybody else doesn't need to go off and do any research. They just take the same comment, assuming that it's correct, and submit that. So shoot it in via the email address, and we'll pick the winner out and let you guys know. So what I thought I'd do here, at least in terms of the presses, go through literally from the front, top to bottom, from the case feeder all the way to station 6, and talk about the individual stations, some of the things that I've learned about them, changes that I've made, and things just kind of to make your whole entire reloading experience with the press a lot better. So we'll take it from there and get going. So let's start out with the case feeder. The case feeder in this is actually an option. You can buy it without the case feeder. It's about a $220 option or so, give or take, and I would highly recommend that you get the case feeder if you do go get the SL900, because otherwise what you're faced with is taking holes individually and dropping them into this tube here, and that tube will probably hold about maybe 6 or 7 holes, and you're going to be constantly trying to feed that thing by hand, which is really going to slow you down. I have since learned this press is extremely fast. To give you an idea in terms of rate, I'm able to reload about 100 shells in 10 minutes, and actually it's probably a little bit less than that. And you can probably get a feel for it here toward the end of this video when you see us reloading on the press, and just exactly how fast it is. It is so fast that I'm able to literally outrun the case feeder here if I'm not paying attention to it. In other words, I'm able to literally cycle shells fast enough through this thing that the case feeder can't keep up. So as I'm running this press, I'm constantly listening for that motor to see if it's running. If it's running and running and running, it's usually a sign for me to start taking a look to see what the drop tube is doing. So frequently I'll go back and look at the drop tube and see what's happening. But in terms of problems that I've had with the case feeder, I talked about this briefly in the very first episode. The biggest problem that you have with the case feeder is jams. And jams do happen with the case feeder, and I kind of installed this little deflector shield in here when I first did some testing with the case feeder, and what I found is that a shell would drop and it would hit the lip here as it came down or fell down here through here. It would drop down, hit the lip, and then get kind of stuck there. So what I did is I install this kind of like a little deflector here. So rather than hitting the lip, it would hit the deflector and then drop into the case feeder and go straight down. And for the most part, that fixed a lot of my problems. But the other problem that you'll have is that a case will be rotating through. Let me just turn this thing on here so you can see how it works. The case will be rotating through and dropping, as you can see here. And right before it drops, for whatever reason, another case will like literally bump into it or whatever and prevent it from dropping into the chute cleanly. And my analogy to this is, let's say you're walking through the door jamb or the front door of your house, and all of a sudden, I don't know, your wife, your kid, whatever, decides to shove you as you're walking through the door, and of course, you know, you bounce off the door jamb and you don't walk through the door. That's kind of effectively what's happening here. As long as you don't have anybody else trying to shove you as you're walking through your door jamb, you're fine. But every once in a while, if somebody evil comes along and decides to give you a little push, you know, you don't exit your door very well. Well, that's kind of what happens with the case feeder. I'm probably, realistically speaking, in terms of the number of jams per 100, it runs anywhere between, say, 1 to 4. I've run this thing for a long time and not had any. I've run it for very few shells and had a few. It's kind of weird. I've not really figured out any rhyme or reason to it. It does seem like the more number of holes that you have in the case feeder, the more likely it is to jam. And it makes kind of sense that you have more holes in there bouncing around doing things, the more likely you're going to see it. But for the most part, that's really all you're going to be looking at in terms of the case feeder. Just literally watch for jams that are maybe happening up here, and watch for the case that you may be outrunning the thing as you're reloading. So let's move on to station 1, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so station 1, there really isn't a whole lot to be said about this except for one thing. And let me just operate this thing here real quick and you can see what happens. So what happens is that as the handle goes down, the whole entire plate assembly goes up and it picks up a hole. And you can see here then that it pushes the hole into position here at station 1. Okay. The only problem that I've ever had here at station 1 is that if you get an errant piece of shot that has dropped and spilled or whatever the case may be and is rolling around the shell plate and it happens to find its way into the guides here and crams itself into literally under the shell plate, because what you can see is that the hole, if I can do this right, slides under a lip here in the shell plate. Well, what happens is that piece of lead gets stuck in there, and rather than the hole sliding all the way, not very good here, sliding all the way forward, it gets kind of stuck back halfway like this. So what happens is that when you go and move the arm up to effectively knock the primer out, it goes up and it jams into basically the sizing die up here. So the rule of thumb always on this stuff, anything mechanical, is if it jams and it stops, don't force it, stop, look and see what's going on. And more often than not, what I found is that whenever this thing stops, I'll literally go over to station 1, take this hole and just push it like that and go up, and that's the issue. And that will then knock the primer out. So that's the primary thing to look for here at station 1, is that you may get like I said, a piece of lead shot crammed into the shell plate, which prevents the hole from being pushed in all the way. That's the only problem I've ever had at station 1. So let's go off and look at station 2. There's a lot of stuff happening here at station 2 to talk about. Station 2 is where it basically seats a primer, and after seating the primer, it drops the shot drops the powder into the hole. Okay, so with station 2 here, there's a lot of things that are going on here with station 2, and a lot of things that I've learned since owning the press, and also we'll show you a design modification that I made. Station 2, we are dropping the primer from the primer tray up here, goes down through a drop tube, falls into a primer transfer arm that picks the primer up, moves it into position under the hole, and then seats the primer into the hole. That all happens in one part of the downstroke, or sorry, the upstroke. Then after you seat it, when you bring the hole up, it then drops the powder into the hole and charges the case. So I'm just going to operate the primer system here so you can actually see how this thing works. So basically, as we pull the arm up, you'll see the transfer arm here go back. A primer has dropped down to the primer tube, goes into the arm, and then you'll notice here that the primer, and you probably can't really see it, but the primer is in the transfer arm here and goes into position under the hole and is ready to be seated. If you push forward here, which is what you do, it then seats it into the hole. Okay, so let's talk about the primer system here for a little bit from the beginning to end. One thing that I've learned here on the primer system is that when you go to drop the primers into the tray here, if you try to drop, say, taking your all 100 primers and put them in here like this and pull the sleeve, and then what you do is you lift this arm and they all slide down into position, there is a probably better than 30% chance that one of those primers will turn sideways as they slide down in the chute here. So what I've learned is that I put the tray on here, pull this back, load 50 or drop 50 onto the tray, lift the arm, let the initial 50 go down, turn this around, drop the other 50, lift the arm and let those go down, and it minimizes the chance of having a sideways primer. If you do get a sideways primer, Dillon gives you this nice little magnet on a stick that what you're supposed to do then is to be able to take this magnet and go in here and take these primers and slide them up into position and hopefully get them out. But you'll see that sometimes, you know, it works, and sometimes you'll always get more than the one you want just because of the fact that it's metallic. So it allows you to kind of fish out the primer that has turned sideways and cause problems. So at least they're nice enough to give you something like that. It kind of works. It could be better, but it is what it is. So let's talk primer system. I would probably say the Achilles heel of the Dillon SL900 is probably the primer system. When I first got the press, I was having a lot of problems getting well, two things to happen. One is you first need to get the primer to drop, and it's controlled by basically a bar here that slides back and forth. And then after it drops, it has to drop through this primer tube and drop into this transfer arm. And first off, I was having problems of not getting it to drop. And then when I did get it to drop, and drop into the primer tube, in the process of dropping into the transfer arm, it would tilt or get sideways and then get popped out or not seated at all entirely and cause all sorts of problems. So there is a pin right here that controls basically how far this transfer arm moves back and forth. The higher you run this pin up, the farther the transfer arm goes. That basically allows you to control when the primer drops into the drop tube. The problem is that the higher you run that pin, the higher basically, or the bigger gap it creates between the drop tube and the face of the transfer arm. So you can kind of see the problem here is that you're kind of optimizing one and losing control of the other. If you don't have this arm high enough, then you won't drop the primers. If you have it too high, you will drop the primers, but then you'll have a good chance of them dropping or kicking out of position. So I had actually a lot of problems with this thing initially, and I measured a gap between the face of the drop tube here and the transfer arm of somewhere around 80 thousandths, 0.080, which is a huge gap. And I happened to see a picture of somebody else's SL900 on the internet, and I noticed it was almost literally flush with it. And I thought, well, that's really strange. You know, I've got a huge gap. Theirs is almost flush. What's going on? So I contacted Dillon, and Dillon sent me an entirely new primer assembly, literally this whole chunk of assembly right here. And I replaced that, and I still had a problem with it. So then talked to one of their techs, and they basically said, send it back. And I sent it back to them, and I bought the press probably about 1 to 2 weeks before the whole entire Sandy Hook incident. And at that point, when I was having problems with it, it was after the Sandy Hook incident, which literally turned, as you probably well aware, the whole entire reloading and shooting world upside down. But they were able to, and it took about a month from the point that I sent it in to the point that I got the press back, and it got it basically, I'm going to say, fixed and back to me. I was experiencing probably about, and I'm just guessing here, but probably about 5 to 10 primer issues, I'm going to say, per 100, and issues being either the primer not dropping, or when it did drop, it would get kicked sideways or popped out of the transfer arm here before sending it down to Dillon. After I sent it down to Dillon and I got it back, I measured the gap, and the gap there was probably right around between 50 to 60 thousandths. So it was much better than what it was before, but it was still a fairly large gap there. And I was still getting about 2 or 3 primer issues per 100 in that either they wouldn't drop, or when they would drop, they would get kicked sideways. And I thought, of course, being an engineer, I'm thinking there's got to be a better way to do this. And I was just thinking, if I could just somehow get this drop tube slightly longer, if it was longer, I would solve all my problems, because if it was longer, I wouldn't have that gap there, and yet I would still be able to drop the primers. So I started thinking about it and came up with an idea that if I could just somehow make it longer, I would fix the problem. So this is what I did. So what I decided basically is that what I needed to do is somehow make this primer drop tube longer. And I was thinking, what can I possibly do to do that? So I got this idea, if I could just somehow stick a washer on the end of this thing that was just the right size and just the right width, it would fix the problem. So what you can do here is there's basically a set screw right here on the press that controls the drop tube here. And I will wiggle this thing out, and you can see what I did. I went to the hardware store, and again, I mentioned that I had about 50 to 60 thousandths gap there. So what I did is I went to the hardware store with my calipers in hand and went through a drawer of Fender washers, and it turns out it's a 7/8 of an inch Fender washer that you're looking for. And I went through and I measured every single one until I found the thinnest one, roughly around 50 thousandths, which is what I was looking for. And after I found my right washer, and you can see here I've done a little bit of sanding on it, try to thin it down. I then took a drill and drilled out the center of the washer to make sure it was big enough that a primer would drop through it. And this was kind of just basically an experiment, because I thought, I'm going to glue this thing on there. I'm going to use super glue, and if it works, then I'll knock the thing off and I'll glue it on with JB Weld to make it more permanent. Well, it turns out super glue is a lot better than what I thought it was, because I put the thing on there with super glue and this thing is stuck on there and it will not come off. And I probably reloaded, I don't know, maybe 2,000 or so, maybe even more than that, shot shell since doing this, and it has turned out perfect. My gap now between the face of this and the transfer arm is about 8 thousandths. In fact, I now use a feeler gauge, my 8 thousandths feeler gauge here, to literally set the exact position of that. So what I'll do, I'm not going to go through the process here, but I'll put this thing back into position, put the feeler gauge in there, and move this up until I get basically 8 thousandths, and then set my set screw. And when I have that, it's exactly in the right position. So after doing that, I have completely eliminated all of my primer feed issues. I have more than enough travel with the primer arm. I have very minimal gap between the primer face and the primer drop tube face and the transfer arm here. And I will not say that I've nearly completely eliminated the problem. Instead of being on the order of, when Dillon returned it to me, of like 2 or 3 out of 1,000, I'm looking probably now about 2 or 3 out of 100. I'm now looking at about 1 out of 1,000. Every once in a while I'll have a primer get kicked out of this thing, and I have no reason or no clue why it did it. And to be honest, I really don't know if it was sideways or what. Maybe it was somehow partially up in the drop tube. Who knows? But it has literally turned it in from a issue to a non-issue. It is extremely reliable now in terms of its operation. So moving beyond that, the other thing that you need to be aware of here, and we actually had one of our viewers comment about this, and Dillon comments about it in their product manual, their troubleshooting guide, but it is really critical that when you seat primers, that you get the primers seated all the way. If you don't seat the primers all the way and you get a high primer, the primer will then catch the transfer arm here, and you'll break this. And Dillon comments about it in the manual, and in fact, it's enough of an issue that they send you an extra one in the parts kit. just in case you do break it, that at least you're not, you know, out of luck until you can get a replacement for it. So I happen to have 2 of them because Dillon sent me an extra one when they sent me the whole entire new transfer arm assembly. But at any rate, that's something to look out for, is that make sure that when you are reloading in this thing that you push all the way forward and get that primer seated completely before basically pulling the handle up to activate the shell plate here, because otherwise you may run a chance of snapping that arm off. The other issue here, I should say, thing that happens here is the powder is dropped in this position also. So on the upstroke here, what happens is it pushes up, it activates the powder mechanism here and drops powder. I've noticed with a situation where we're running very low humidity that when I do this, since this is metal and it wipes the hole after dropping the powder, that the powder will literally cling to the hole very quickly, and you'll see like little flakes of powder all the way around here. So again, I'm running clays, and maybe clays is more sensitive to that than others. I probably in reality ought to take a dryer sheet and wipe the inside of my my hopper out, and maybe that'll help, and maybe it won't, I don't know. But I've noticed that as the humidity goes down, my static clean problems go up. The other thing that you're gonna may notice here, and this is just a demonstration, but this is a Remington gun club hole that has had what's called case head separation. This is not a fault of the press, this is a fault of gun club holes. In fact, I've got 4 more holes here that have done the exact same thing. And if you look around on the internet and go and look at basically Remington gun club case head separation, you will find threads and comments and whatnot about the issue. The problem is that it shows up here at station 2 where you have just seated the powder and then pulled the arm down, which is literally trying to pull this thing, I should say separator or whatever, you're trying to pull the hole out, and this is when it separates. So that's one thing to look out for. I will warn you that I didn't realize the very first time that this happened that if you look at this very closely, the inside of that case head has very sharp, jagged corners there where it holds the primer. I didn't realize it did that. I went to basically, when I saw the primer there, I thought, okay, well, I'll just push it out with my thumb. Pushed it out and perforated my thumb nicely with 8 little small holes, and then blood all over the place. So don't do that. If you do have a primer that gets stuck here, you have 1 or 2 choices. The safe one would probably be just to throw it away. If you're cheap like me, I place this basically over a diameter hole that's bigger than the primer. Take a wooden dowel or something and push the primer out and reuse the primer. So just something to watch out for there on station 2. But again, it only happens with these Remington gun club holes, and it only happens with the once fired ones, which makes sense because the once fired ones have not been stressed or anything like that. And the very first time you go and stress them by trying to reload them, you'll get case head separation. And in fact, even some of the threads that you'll read about, guys have had case head separation in the gun itself at the extractor. So let's move on to station 3. Okay, so station 3, you have kind of 2 things going on here. One is that you are seating the wad, so you put the wad in the wad guide here, and then as it moves it into position, and then we'll seat it into the hole that normally would be here. There is an adjustment here for centering, and it's really kind of important that you make sure this is right, but centering the wad guide here within the arm, or sorry, within the assembly here. There's a screw down here that adjusts the positioning of this arm. And it is really important that you get this arm correctly centered over this, because if you don't, what will happen is the wad will come down and catch the lip of some of the holes, and you'll literally tear or may tear wad guides or catch the lips of these things as they're going in. So what I've learned is basically make sure this thing gets centered here right over the hole. It's very easy to do with that screw, and it really eliminates the amount of problems you're going to have here as far as torn wads or ripped lips on the holes. If you do, let's say you use a really old crappy hole that is probably beyond its useful lifespan, but you're reloading it anyway, and you do end up cramming a wad into this thing and jamming it, there is a retaining pin here on the arm. So what's going to happen is that you've got the thing completely stuck at this position here, and you can't pull it down and you can't push it up, because pushing it up just rips it more, and pulling it down, there's no way to pull it out. You've got the thing jammed in there. So what you do, and I'm just going to simulate this thing that it's in the up position here, you remove this pin here, this pin pops out, and then this whole entire arm assembly lifts. And I'm just going to drop this thing here a little bit so I can clear the machine. The arm assembly pulls out, and you can then get the watt out of that thing and then put the arm assembly in. What you need to do is make sure that the spring is oriented the correct way when you put this thing back in. You put that back in, and you take this pin, slip it back into position, which I'm not doing a very good job of here. Well, take my word for it, that works. I'm not going to spend time on that. The other thing is that I am loading 7/8 of an ounce loads, light loads, and the powder bar that normally comes with this press will reload from roughly 1 ounce up to about, that's about 1 5/8 ounce loads. And I'm, like I said, loading 7/8, which doesn't work with the stock shot bar that comes with this thing. So I initially bought what's called a reduced capacity shot bar, which goes down to about a 1/2 ounce up to roughly 1 ounce. The problem is that you'll notice here, let me make a note of what that looks like. I'm going to try to get the original shot bar out here by undoing this assembly a little more. Yeah, we'll do it a little more. Oh, no wonder. It helps if you use a wrench. Helps if you use the right wrench. Okay. Now we can get it out. Okay, so you'll note the difference in the way these two shot bars are shaped, and you'll notice that there is this cavity right here on this bar. The problem is that I discovered, is that this bar slides back and forth, and this cavity actually exceeds the drop tube hole here in the shot assembly. So what happens is that as you push it forward, it drops the shot, and as you pull it back, as it goes back and forth, there would be a few pellets that would be sitting around in this thing, and they get drugged back over the shot tube, and as the arm is now basically going in the down position, you would have shot pellets drop out of the drop tube, which was rather annoying. So I'm thinking, okay, how can I take this bar and modify it and make it work? Well, I don't know if you can see this thing very well here, but what I did is that you can see kind of a spacer here, or a gap. This is actually a piece of Delrin plastic. This piece here is actually shaped concave like this. And what I did is I basically put this piece of plastic in there that is shaped to that thing so it's perfectly flat. And I've reduced the capacity of this bar from running from roughly 1 to 1 5/8 ounces down to about a little over a 1/2 to a little over 1 ounce. So it'll run, let's say right now, about a 1/2 ounce to 1 1/8 ounce. Well, I like to load either 3/4 of an ounce or 7/8 of an ounce loads, and right now I got it set up for 7/8 of an ounce load. The perfect thing about this right now is that there's no little cavity for shot pellets to hide in. As I'm operating the bar back and forth, and I've reduced my shot spillage down to nearly nothing now with the modification of this bar. So it's a very easy thing to do. I literally just you can unscrew this bolt here. Basically the adjustable piece of the shot bar comes out. I scribed the shape of the cavity here on a piece of Delrin, took it to a belt sander, sanded it down, got it close to the line, did a little fine tweaking until it kind of fit in there, and then again, using my favorite friend super glue, glued it into place, and have pretty much eliminated all my problems here in terms of shot spillage. So that turned out to be a really great modification, because it was really annoying from time to time having just shot pellets drop around this thing. So at any rate, station 4 here is where the crimp is being done, and what I found is, we can kind of show this here, it's an easy thing to do. is that I like to crimp these things so roughly the size of a pencil eraser. That's a little bit more than a pencil eraser diameter right now. In fact, it's a little bit excessive. But you want this about the size of a pencil eraser that would fit in that hole there. So let me grab another one here and just see what that would do. Well, that one's pretty tight too. So it looks like I may need to actually open my pre-crimp up a little bit. If you overly or excessively adjust the pre-crimp, what you're going to get is swirl in your final crimp. Swirl is not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're looking for that picture perfect crimp where you have just like, you know, 8 petals perfectly formed in the center, you know, that's not going to happen. But swirl basically means that the petals come in and then you get right in the very middle, you get a little bit of a twist or whatever in the crimp. And again, like I said before, as long as the shot doesn't follow the holes, I'm good with it. So I'm not really too picky about the perfect looking crimp. I know John likes his crimps perfect looking, like factory fresh, but I'm not that picky about it. If they close and shot doesn't follow it, I'm good. The last position here is the final crimp, and there are 2 things that you can adjust here. Basically what it's adjusting is the seat depth, and I'm just going to randomly grab a hole here just to kind of talk a little bit about seat depth. So the seat depth is basically how deep the crimp is here relative to the top of the case, and what you're typically looking for is about 55 thousandths or so, give or take. So let's just see roughly where we are here. Okay, well my calipers are actually off by about 20 thousandths. So even though this is saying 72, in reality that's about 52. So that's roughly what you're looking for here in terms of seat depth. So there's a center punch that comes down and basically is forming the petals together. And then there's actually a roll part of this which then tapers the outer edge of the case here. And there's actually 2 adjustments here on the final stage here where that can be tweaked. And since I'm not using an autoloader and I don't care so much, but if you adjust the outer, this piece here alone, that adjusts effectively the roll crimp. If you adjust the top piece here, which is the center punch, it adjusts the crimp depth. So obviously if you just take this thing and screw it down, you're going to be adjusting both at the same time. You're going to be adjusting the roll crimp and the depth. If you just want to adjust the depth alone, you adjust the center punch there. Okay, now that we've got everything put back together here, I just thought I'd kind of go through and demonstrate my reloading process, the speed that I'm running at, and basically what I'm looking for and what I'm listening for. One thing I've learned here now that I've used this press quite a bit is that I can literally outrun the case feeder, and if I'm not careful, I will, because of the speed that this thing actually reloads, and to give you an idea, I'm reloading roughly about 100 shells in 10 minutes in this thing, or about 600 shells in an hour. But because of the fact that it's so quick, I'm literally able to outrun the rate that holes are dropped into the drop tube here. So what I'm listening for as I'm reloading is the case feeder running. If I hear that case feeder running and running and running and running while I'm reloading, at some point I'm going to stop and take a look at my tube here to see just exactly how full of shells or how full of holes it is. On the other hand, if I'm pulling the handle and I'm not hearing the case feeder running, that's probably a sign that I've got a jammed hole up at the top of the case feeder, which we talked about earlier, of the whys and wherefores of that. So as I'm reloading, I'm listening for the case feeder, what's going on. The other thing that I'm doing is the only thing that I do now in terms of watching is that I'm watching the primer be transferred into the transfer arm under the hole in station 2. I used to, when I was first starting out, I'd literally watch the primer in the arm drop down, then watch it in the transfer arm here and get moved into position. I now have enough faith in what's going on with the primer system of that I don't really actually pay attention to what's happening up here. I'm really more paying attention to what's going on down here. So just between just watching this and listening to what's going on, that's really when I get into my mode here of reloading. That's really what I'm doing. So I'm just going to kind of demonstrate here the rate that I'm running. You can kind of get a feel for how fast the press really runs. and just kind of what I'm doing here. So I've got all the stations all loaded up here. I've got everything ready to go. My wad is in position here. I just have like a little Tupperware bin here of wads. Still using the older, or I shouldn't say the older, but the incorrect, what I would define as the incorrect wad, which is the Claybuster CB1100, which is a 1 ounce wad. I'm loading, as I said before, 7/8 ounce load. I'm going to be switching here shortly, once I run out of these, to the Claybuster gray wad, which is a CB0178, which is really the optimum wad for loading a 7/8 ounce load. So I'm very close to switching over to that. When I switch over to that, I get to make some small adjustments to the press in terms of really just the wad depth or the wad pressure. But other than that, everything should pretty much just go. So here's what it's all about. Get everything all loaded up. Wad's in position here. Hold the handle. Watch the primer move. Pick up a wad. Put it in. Hold the handle. And that's really what it gets down to at this point. And in reality, you know, I said that I'm loading about, say, 100 shells in 10 minutes or so. It's probably actually a little bit faster than that in terms of the actual rate that I'm pulling the handle, but I look at it from the standpoint of you're loading primers into the tray, you're putting shot into the hopper, you're putting powder into the powder reservoir. There's a little bit of time there for all that, but generally speaking, this thing moves really quick. It's really consistent. I'm getting pretty good now in terms of crimps. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm getting a pretty decent crimp now in terms of what I'm able to pull off with the press now. I've got it dialed in pretty good in terms of what I'm seeing now in terms of decent crimps. John may or may not be happy with that, but my philosophy is as long as the shot doesn't drop out of the shot shell, I'm good with it. So at any rate. So if you have any questions, any comments, any feedback on this episode or anything like that, you can reach us at the usual powerfactorshow@gmail.com, website powerfactorshow.com, and as always, you can like us on Facebook at facebook.com/powerfactorshow. And also remember to get your answers into the trivia question. Go ahead and send those probably directly to us on the email. Is probably the best response. And always, like we mentioned before, this program is basically kind of like public TV or public broadcast or whatever. It's like you're going to get it whether you pay for it or not. Unfortunately, we're not subsidized by the government, and the government probably wouldn't subsidize us anyway because obviously we have things to do with shooting, and you know how much they like that. But again, if you feel like you've learned something from a lot of these programs and whatnot, go ahead and fire us off a few bucks or something like that. We definitely appreciate it. Helps pay for the internet and everything like that. So again, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time.